the extent to which George R. R. Martin accidentally wrote the best gay vampire love story ever written. Hello and welcome back to another video on here on the channel. As I promised / threatened in both my 2020 wrap-up video and my latest video about my to-be-read list for 2021, this is the video where I'm going to go through and review all of the books that I read in 2020. I say review, these are not going to be full-blown, in-depth reviews. These are going to be mini reviews and I'm going to be putting them into a tier list. Now, as I mentioned in my previous two videos, I read 26 books last year. Well, I read 25.8 books last year. I did not finish The Wise Man's Fear, but I did read most of it, so I am counting it. I think that's fair. If you want to dispute me in the comments, go ahead. It's engagement, it's good for the channel. Since I've mentioned it, I guess we'll do The Wise Man's Fear and The Name of the Wind first. The Kingkiller Chronicle. This, I'm gonna put it pretty high up. It took a while for me to get into The Name of the Wind, but once it got going, I got really invested in it. Definitely gonna be an A or B tier. If you don't know, if you've not read, I'm gonna try and keep this spoiler-free, maybe a few minor spoilers, but nothing major. But if I accidentally go ahead and spoil some huge plot point, I'll do my best to put spoiler warnings in the description and time code so you can skip around and jump over spoilery bits. So there's this guy called Kvoth, difficult name to say. He has lived a life, he's become somewhat of a folk hero and he is now in hiding. But he meets this guy called the Chronicler. His whole thing is writing biographies of people. And he meets Kvoth and figures out who he really is. And they agree that one time and one time only, Kvoth will get to tell his story, the true story, not the rumours and folk stories that have been spread. This is the true biographical story of him, and so that's the framing device for the book, and most of the book is Kvoth in first person relaying his own story. And it takes a while for Kvoth and Chronicler to actually meet and for the story to properly start being told. Up until that point I wasn't hugely invested, but once we actually get there and get into it, I did get very much invested. Another problem I have with the series is quite a few times on his travels Kvoth meets someone who starts telling a story and it's sort of a lore dump about the world, and then you end up in the situation where you've got someone telling a story about someone telling a story about someone telling a story, which is something that I don't particularly enjoy as a reader. Nonetheless, once Kvoth reaches the university, which is where he goes to learn magic, and we start to learn about the magic system, that's when it really takes off and becomes a really good novel. And I have to say, when I finished this book, I planned to read Conjuring of Light, the final book in Shades of Magic series, immediately afterwards. But when I finished Name of the Wind, the world and the characters were so on my mind that I just had to dive into the sequel. And I think overall, I'm gonna put it in A tier. A really great fantasy read. So let's move on to the sequel now that we started talking about it, The Wise Man's Fear. As I mentioned, the first time I ever heard of this series, I was just perusing some books in a bookshop, and I saw this book on a shelf and I was like, ooh, The Wise Man's Fear, that's a very intriguing title. And the cover especially, we've got him doing his action pose there with all the dead foliage surrounding him. Really great book cover, really great book title. That's what got me interested in this series in the first place. And I didn't quite enjoy The Wise Man's Fear as much as I enjoyed The Name of the Wind. I did still very much enjoy it, but it got to a point around the middle of the book where it's sort of starting to feel like, okay, where are we going with this? This is starting to feel very aimless. The first book has a clear beginning, middle and end, and obviously there's more stuff going on and there's intrigue, and it's a story of someone's life, and it's not necessarily straight A to B to C. There's other things that happen and little side tangents that crop up. But I nevertheless felt satisfied when I finished Name of the Wind that I'd read a complete story or a complete installment in a trilogy. Whereas The Wise Man's Fear, we get to a point where Kvoth he takes a break from the university and goes traveling. He has a gap year, essentially. And from there, it was pretty much a constant stream when I was reading of me just going, okay, but can we get back to the university? Because while what was written was good and it was enjoyable to read, I'm gonna go back to an analogy I used in a previous video. It feels like he's just picking up side quests and then going and doing them before he's even finished the side quests that he that he got in the first place. It's like, oh, he goes to stay with this noble, and he's got to impress this noble because they might be a patron for him. And then he's got to go find some bandits and deal with the bandits. And then he makes friends with this guy who's one of the Adem. Then turns out that breaks something in his culture, and then he's got to go over to this guy's hometown and try and clear his name. And it's just a whole bunch of side plots on side plots on side plots on side plots, and it feels very much like it's just sort of one thing after another without really going anywhere. At the end of this book, I did not feel quite as satisfied as I did at the end of The Name of the Wind, and I think for those reasons that's going to knock it down a tier, so that's going to put it in B tier, because it was still good. I did still enjoy it. Whatever it was that grabbed me in the first book wasn't quite there to the same extent in the second book. The Children of Time next. The Children of Time. This came very highly recommended to me by a friend. Basic premise of this book, without getting too much into it, it's in the far-flung future in space. There's this planet full of super fast-evolving, highly intelligent spiders, and then there's the humans on the ship, and we get to follow both sides of the confrontation that it's sort of building towards. What really sold me from my friend's recommendation is he said, you actually start to root for the spiders as the book goes on, which I took as a challenge because I am arachnophobic and I absolutely can't stand spiders. So this book has its merits, but I have to say it did fall short of my expectation. And while I do agree that at a certain point you start rooting for the spiders, and that is a cool take to have, there's not, for me, enough effort put into the characterization on the human side to make that distinction worthwhile. The human that we follow, our POV insert to the human side of this story, has basically no personality. And there are other supporting characters around him who are really interesting and would be really fun to follow, but this guy that we're following, he's just kind of going along with whatever, bouncing around like a gas particle or a DVD logo. Things are happening and you'd be like, surely he's gonna react to that. He's gonna have an emotional reaction to what some of his other crewmates have started doing, some of the like dark turns that they're taking, or some of them are becoming rebels. Maybe he's gonna join the rebel forces and fight for the good of humanity, but no, he just kind of goes about doing whatever. Absolute highlight of this book, there is a period of time when we're in the spiders' perspective. In the spider society, it's very much a matriarchy. Female spiders are in charge and the male spiders are servitude to them. But there is a period of this book where one of the male spiders starts fighting for spider rights. That was a fantastic sequence. Definitely the highlight of this book for me. Another problem I think that arose with this book for me is, with the human side, we are following the same characters, and occasionally they'll go into cryosleep and like bunch of years will pass and then they'll come back out and things will have changed, and during that time the spider society down on the planet side will have evolved more and they'll have developed more tools and more intelligence and stuff like that. But that means that we're not following the same spider characters all the way through. I think there was a missed opportunity not to get to a certain point with the spiders and just say, okay, they're evolved enough now that the confrontation is going to be interesting, and now we're going to stick with the same characters on the spiders' side of things, and you're going to become invested in them, and you're going to get invested in both sides of the fight. And it's definitely a well-written book, and I did enjoy reading it at the time, but the more... It's been exactly a year since I read this, and the more I sort of think about it, the more problems I find that I had with it. And it is a well-written book, and I understand why it won the awards it did. And I don't mean to... writing a novel is hard, and I don't mean to berate authors for their efforts. Writing any novel is a huge undertaking, and I have respect for people who do it, but this list is based on my personal taste, and for me, personally, Children of Time is going to end up in C tier. I read a couple of George R.R. Martin's early works, Fever Dream and the Armageddon Rag. Fever Dream is a vampire story. That was the one I read first. I have mixed feelings about that one. What I very much did enjoy about this one is the extent to which George R.R. Martin accidentally wrote the best gay vampire love story ever written. The sexual tension between a late to middle-aged steamboat captain and a vampire. Who knew? There was a lot of very interesting stuff in this. The vampire societies and the backstory of the main vampire character that we have who becomes friends with our lead guy. I really enjoyed that sequence where he sat down and was just like, okay, I'm gonna tell you the truth about everything. You can't interrupt me. Here it all is. That was a really cool sequence and a really cool bittersweet backstory to that character, which I absolutely loved. The main character of this book is a fairly obvious Martin self-insert. He was a character I liked well enough. Wasn't hugely invested in him. I was more invested in the vampire character. The main character is a steamboat captain, and something that really works well in this book is the attachment that you feel towards the ships. You can tell that this guy really is emotionally invested in the ships that he captains and creates and steers, and as a reader you really get to empathise with that side of things, and when like the ships get damaged you really feel like the heartbreak of losing them. Came across really well done. There were certain things I did not like about this novel as well. The bad guys. So we've got an evil vampire, we've got his assistant who's a human who's been promised that he's going to be turned into a vampire once he is useful enough. And this book is set in a time when slavery is still very much a very common thing, and there was a lot of what you might call realistic depictions of slavery, and obviously it's a horrible thing that happened in the past. I don't want to sweep it under the rug, but I also don't enjoy reading in so much detail about the atrocities that happened to certain people who were victims of the slave trade. And this book does quite an early chapter from the perspective of this guy who's the assistant, the human assistant to the vampire big bad, where he goes to a slave market and picks out a slave for his master. Just really not a fun time to read, especially because this human guy has no redeeming qualities whatsoever. Like in A Song of Ice and Fire, right? Or in The First Law. Yes, you've got bad characters who are unquestionably bad people, they do morally reprehensible things all the time, but they're still enjoyable to read. You still get invested in them, whereas this guy, not only was he a horrible person, he was also kind of boring and had no redeeming qualities, and it was just impossible to get invested in him, and I did not enjoy reading his chapters at all. So I am going to put Fever Dream also in C tier, but I'm going to put it above Children of Time. I did enjoy it more than Children of Time. And let's move on to the Armageddon Rag. This was an interesting one. We follow an author who used to be an investigative journalist. He's now a crime author. But then he gets wind of this new case that's come up about a band called the Nazgul. He goes and starts doing some investigative journalism and gets caught into this whole conspiracy surrounding this band. And I have to say I really dug this one. Thinking back on it, I think I would read this one again over Fever Dream. I think this is gonna be B, maybe A, probably B tier. Definitely really enjoyed it. Something that really got across well was the energy of a band that you can become really invested in. There are quite a few times where the author remembers seeing a band back in the day, back in the swinging 60s, and then the band have a bit of a reunion later on in the book, and you get like the passion of like what a musical performance can be. There are points in the book where the band are performing, and you can hear the songs through the page, and that whole aspect of it comes across really well. The mystery is done really well, and also quite a big portion of the book involves our main character going back and reconnecting with a bunch of his old college friends, and the characters here are just really strong. You really feel the bittersweetness of friendships that come and go. Really cool mystery, really strong characters, really enjoyed reading the Armageddon Rag. Also, as I mentioned, the band that features in the book are called the Nazgul, and there's just lots of references to Lord of the Rings, which obviously I loved. I'm gonna put that in B tier. I mentioned The First Law there a minute ago. Joe Abercrombie released his latest addition into the First Law universe, The Trouble with Peace, last year. That was one of the books that I read. This book was excellent, and I think this is gonna be my first entry into S tier. I'm not sure if I enjoyed it more than A Little Hatred. I think I maybe did. A Little Hatred did a really good job setting up the new characters that we're gonna follow, especially the main four, Rika, Leo, Orso, and Savine. There were also a couple of other characters that were introduced in A Little Hatred as POV characters, Vic and Broad. In A Little Hatred, I didn't really care about their stories as much, but in The Trouble with Peace, I really did get a bit more invested in them, especially in Vic's storyline. I don't know what it is, but in Trouble with Peace, I really enjoyed Vic's chapters. I found her character a lot more interesting, and I was always looking forward to getting to one of her chapters. I love the way that the relationships established between these new POV characters started to evolve and interact. Pretty much a perfect continuation of this new trilogy, The Age of Madness. Often a middle book can be hard to pull off, but I think this one ticked all the boxes for me. We also got introduced to Japo. What a great character. He was only in one chapter, but he stole the scene. Also, I think has become my favourite character from the new lot of characters that we're following. It was Ricker, but now I think it's also. I'm not sure what's going to happen with Leo in the third book. I'm hoping for some kind of redemption arc. I really enjoyed the confrontation that he and Also had, where they had that sort of peace treaty dinner. Really great stuff. It's hard to do a middle book in a trilogy. I think I said that already, but yeah. This was an absolutely great read. Loved it. That's the first book that's going in S tier for this. These are not going to be full-blown, in-depth reviews. These are going to be mini reviews. Probably going to have to split this up into multiple parts.